Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Monday evening Introduction to Philosophy, Theory, Art, Literature live stream. My name is Julian. If you're new here, this is a weekly live stream lecture that I've been hosting for the past 3 years, in which I try to share some ideas about reading, about philosophy, about art, about really just creating, hopefully, an inspiring and encouraging environment for people who are into those things like myself. Please do stick around if you'd like for the next 45 minutes. I'm going to be here live talking about one of my favorite novels, namely Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks, which will hopefully be a good reading recommendation for yourself if you haven't read it already. And if you're more familiar with Buddenbrooks or perhaps Thomas Mann's other works like Death in Venice or The Magic Mountain, then perhaps this will also be interesting for you having read those works. We're going to be talking about Thomas Mann's famous irony. We're going to talk about his affinity for Wagnerian leitmotif, for the Wagnerian leitmotif, I should say, and various other aspects of Thomas Mann's writing that make it, to my mind, very interesting and very worth reading. A huge thank you to the patrons who continue to make these open access lectures possible in the first place. I'm so glad that there are people who are able to help me keep hosting these classes. It really means a lot. If you'd like to be part of our Patreon community, simply go to www.patreon.com/Julian Philosophy, where you can download my ebook Guide to Zizek and Hegel, as well as all the lecture transcripts for every lecture that I've posted, as well as audio downloads, so you can listen to these lectures as a podcast wherever you go. A huge thank you also to Jeneline, who edits all of the lectures and who essentially manages our Patreon community. So thank you to Jeneline. I appreciate you. In fact, she's sitting in the other room. So lots of love sent over to Jeneline right now. Please do drop a comment letting me know where you're joining us from. Always makes me very happy seeing people join us from around the world. If you're wondering where I am currently in Hamburg in Germany, and which I thought would be a fitting locale to talk about Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks, since we are in the sort of Hanseatic core of Germany, and we're right next to the river Elbe. We're very close to that type of environment that Thomas Mann was writing about in the Buddenbrooks. I see someone from Pakistan. Hello, greetings from Pakistan. Greetings to Pakistan. I see India, Algeria. Hello. Boston, India, hello, India, Iraq, Kurdistan, South Africa, California. That's incredible. That's wonderful. Thank you guys so much. Okay, so let's begin. This is going to be a standalone lecture where I'd like to talk a little bit about one of my favorite authors, the German author Thomas Mann. And I'm going to start with a brief introduction about Thomas Mann himself, and then sort of lead into the novel The Buddenbrooks, which is perhaps arguably the most famous of German novels. It's certainly a novel that almost every German student will at some point have encountered, and it's considered the great German realist novel. It's essentially, to very briefly summarize, it is the story of 4 generations of a wealthy merchant family, and it is the slow decline of their way of life and of their wealth and riches. It's essentially a story about how a family loses its generational wealth. But it's so much more than that. It's a wonderful, wonderful novel that I'm going to be trying to explore here a little bit in this live stream. But first, who is or was Thomas Mann? So Thomas Mann was an author, obviously, who actually wrote the Buddenbrooks when he was very young. The Buddenbrooks came out in 1902, I believe, when Thomas Mann was just 26 years old, which is really remarkable if you think about it. It's almost a little bit depressing to think about people doing these amazing things when they're still so young, so incredibly gifted. And Thomas Mann had really set out to write what he wanted to be the great German realist novel. And when I say the great German realist novel, essentially what he wanted to do was to move away from epic lyricism, to move away from the romantic writing that had characterized, for example, the work of Schiller or Goethe. Not that Thomas Mann didn't admire those writers, but specifically he wanted to write a new and modern type of novel, a novel that truly reflected a certain class of his society, a class that he was intimately familiar with, a certain, if not aristocratic, then what one today would call upper middle class mercantile society of businessmen and all the customs associated with their lives and the self-importance of these groups. And he was intimately familiar with this because he himself came from one of those merchant families and had, if you will, like a very privileged understanding of what that life was like, which also gave him the opportunity to skewer it and to write about it in a very, both very loving and intimate way, but also a very satirical way. He really understood it from within, so to speak. In fact, a couple of years ago, I was listening to a lecture, it was actually an interview at the Frankfurter Büchermesse, with the Frankfurt Book Fair. And the fashion designer, Karl Lagerfeld, who himself was also the son of a wealthy mercantile family in Hamburg, was asked whether or not he liked the Buddenbrooks. And he actually said that he really disliked it because he said nothing felt new to him, that everything was too close to his own lived experience. And which is understandable, of course. In a sense, what Thomas Mann was doing was that he was writing about the world that he knew. And he was caricaturing it, but also writing about it with a kind of the way someone can only make fun of you if they truly love you, if they truly know you. It's a very intimate portrait of a society and a moment in German society of great arrogance, also of great prestige and wealth that was already beginning to fade away at the turn of the 19th century. In fact, that whole way of life no longer exists today. Certainly some of the wealth in Hamburg still exists, but it's of a very different type of identity, and it's a very different type of pride that comes with it that was once the signifier of these Hanseatic families. For example, today, I went on a little walk at the riverbank, and there are these mansions that you can see on the riverbank. And there's a plaque that reads that these mansions used to belong to a wealthy family of brewers. Essentially, they provided not just Germany, but a large part of Northern Europe with German brewed beer. And not only did they build these villas on the waterfront, they actually built an entire brewery on the waterfront. Except those villas are still there, but they've been renovated into office space. And so today you can see how that those spaces still exist, except now they're being used for corporations. They're no longer being used for these family-owned, family-run businesses. But of course, that's the beginning of that whole process. And whilst today you would see a Ferrari, for example, parked in one of these villas, you would the equivalent of that would have been to see a beautiful horse-drawn carriage, etc. So there's certain elements of it are sustained today if you go to these areas, but it's still very different. In fact, to return to Karl Lagerfeld for a moment, one of Lagerfeld's distinctive styles, his look, was to wear one of these really, really high collared white shirts. Which we used to be referred to colloquially as Vatermörder, like the murderers of fathers, which was considered very old-fashioned even towards the turn of the 19th century. And part of why Lagerfeld still wore it is because he himself remembered his grandfather wearing one of those stiff starched collars in which your neck entirely disappears. You can look up pictures of it if you're curious. And this kind of stiff what in Germany would be called hochnasig, so with the nose in the air, this very stiff and regal upper class way of living was distinctly part of the world that Thomas Mann grew up in. And this runs throughout his books. So, for example, you don't have to read the Buddenbrooks. If you read The Magic Mountain, Der Zauberberg, you'll find that one of the opening chapters is a very loving recollection, a flashback, essentially, in which one of the characters remembers as a young boy being oppressed with his grandfather because his grandfather shows him a dish. It's a silver bowl. And there are names inscribed in that bowl, and those are the names of all the children who have been baptized in said bowl as part of that family. And as the little boy looks into this dish and sees his own blurring reflection, he feels like he's falling into losing a sense of time and space. In other words, he sees himself reflected in his own family lineage and starts to identify himself as being an important part of the family tree. Of course, a lot of these affectations were built and modeled upon the aristocracy. For example, in France, if you wanted to attend a royal baptism, for example, you had to show that your family tree had at least 100 branches on it, etc. So proving your genetic worth was your ancestry was very important. In fact, the aristocrats took it to a totally bizarre level. For example, when Marie Antoinette was to bear her child. So when she was giving birth, aristocrats who were high enough on the aristocratic ladder were invited to watch her give birth to her children. And so they would literally pull up chairs to watch the queen reproduce. Now, of course, this would not be true for the world that Thomas Mann grew up in, but you can see how the sense of self-importance and the identifying according to the family tree is an affectation that these upper classes derived from the aristocracy. In fact, they see themselves as a continuation of the aristocracy, except that they also look down upon them because, unlike the aristocracy, they've worked for their money, they've made their own wealth, etc. However, I still haven't really talked about the Buddenbrooks, so let's try to get a little bit back to the point. So Thomas Mann, 26 years old, releases the Buddenbrooks. And in its second issue, its republication, it becomes an enormous publishing sensation. So much so that eventually Buddenbrooks would be awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. Now, this in and of itself is remarkable because the Nobel Prize in Literature is usually not awarded to a single work, but to an author, usually a body who has usually created a body of work over time. And yet the Buddenbrooks in its own right was considered such an intellectual and aesthetic accomplishment that it was given the Nobel Prize as a singular work of German self-identity, an aesthetic reflection of a certain moment in German history. And what Thomas Mann did, and if you can read about this in his own letters, essentially what he did is that he went to Italy on vacation. Sounds very idyllic. And he rented a little cabin together with his brother on a hillside. And he essentially worked all day, as long as the weather permitted, on the Buddenbrooks. He created this elaborate first draft of what would become this incredibly important work. And the way in which he wrote it was to essentially combine two genres. It was to combine realist writing, modeled upon Italian realist writers, but also the French style of the roman à clef, which was the style of writing in which you would essentially write about really existing people and really existing families, usually upper class, but you would do it in a thinly veiled manner so that reading the text would itself be a kind of parlor game for said upper classes who would try to puzzle out who was being depicted in the works. And that even continues today. Like if you ask certain family members of mine, some of my German family members, they will claim that they know people who are represented in the Buddenbrooks, that they know who the real inspiration was, etc. It's something that, it's an affectation that continues up until today. And essentially, this is something that Thomas Mann therefore didn't invent. Proust, of course, already famously did it with In Search of Lost Time. There's lots of characters from the Belle Époque in France and in Paris that would recognize themselves in the work. But it was also something that even Kierkegaard did, for example. Even though Kierkegaard was writing under various pseudonyms, the whole point of his work that other people could recognize the actual Kierkegaard and some of the other characters in the place in which he lived. And so Thomas Mann manages to combine this epic realist work that tells a story that is both universal and deeply particular, both about German natural identity, but also about the lived existence of one family. And then he does it in such a way that other people start recognizing themselves in it. It is drawn from life, so to speak. And now I want to lay out to you the basic plot of the Buddenbrooks without giving too much away. So the basic plot of the Buddenbrooks, as I said before, is that we have four generations of a family called Buddenbrooks who have become immensely wealthy and powerful. And they've done so by means of being grain merchants. In fact, if you follow for example, the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, a lot of the discussion at the time was about the distribution of grain and the economic consequences that this would have if it would disrupt the grain market. And this was one of the main it remains one of the main markets, but it was one of the main sources of incredible wealth in Germany at the time. And so they are grain merchants, which means that they actually have silos of grain that they keep. But above all, they're constantly trading with others, and they're also capitalists. They're essentially drawing loans, taking out loans, and funding other companies, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this family essentially consists of four generations, but the main characters that we spend most of the time with in the novel are three siblings. It's essentially, if you will, has components of what is known as the Bildungsroman. And so a Bildungsroman is a German genre of 19th century writing, excuse me, in which we have characters who we follow from their youth into their maturation, what in an English novel would be called a sentimental education. In other words, that they become themselves. They fall in love, they have successes, and they suffer successes and failures. We essentially watch them grow up. And the same thing happens in the Buddenbrooks. We have three characters. We have Thomas Buddenbrook, who is the good son. He's the first son, the one who's supposed to take over the company from the elderly Johann Buddenbrook. Then we have the second son called Christian Buddenbrook, and Christian is the quote-unquote bad son. If you want to put it like in terms of the English monarchy, we have William and Harry. The Thomas Buddenbrook is the William, the one who does everything right, who's the Thronfolger, as it were, the first in line for succession. And then we have Christian Buddenbrook, the Harry figure, who doesn't want to be part of the family corporation, who doesn't feel comfortable as a businessman, who wants to go to the theater, and who suffers from various neuroses, which I can return to in a moment. And then the third character that we have is Antony, or Toni Buddenbrook. And in many ways, she's the heart of this novel. She's the most tragic figure, if you will. And a lot of the novel focuses on the relationship between the elder brother, between Thomas Buddenbrook and his little sister, Antony Buddenbrook. And her identity in the family is profoundly interesting. In fact, I think you could essentially view this entire novel as being the sentimental education of Antony Buddenbrook. It's beautiful and yet deeply tragic. Those are the three main characters that you need to know if you want to get into this book. Of course, there's a whole host of other characters that run throughout it. And what we see, again, without not wanting to give too much away, what we essentially see is how these three characters navigate being members of this company their entire lives, a company which lends their lives meaning, but also which sets them up for failure and suffering, as inevitably the company finds itself in decline, and with it, the family finds itself in decline. After all, if your entire identity is predicated on the relative net worth of your company, then it means that you don't exist without your company. And so that's essentially what the story is about from a plot perspective. Now, I'd like to introduce a couple of themes that run throughout this novel and try to explain what makes them so interesting. I do want to very briefly say, as a side note, that it's very hard to talk about the pleasures of reading and the pleasure of experiencing a novel firsthand. And so I really would encourage you to take some time to read a chapter or two to just get a sense for the language and a sense for the way in which the story is told, which is very difficult for me to relate to you here. And so that's perhaps for another lecture, the pleasure of reading and the pleasure of the text itself, and enjoying familiarizing yourself with the various ways in which Thomas Mann achieves an immense degree of psychological realism and how he depicts these characters. And it's a really, in some ways, an exhausting novel because it's almost 1,000 pages long. And what makes it exhausting is not that it's so long or that it has so many characters. Anyone who's watched Game of Thrones knows that length or character count doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's that the epic scope of the story, the trials and tribulations that these characters undergo, feel so genuinely lived in that you come out of the novel really feeling like you've taken a couple of gut punches to the soul of yourself in the process of going through this book. There's some deeply, deeply tragic, but also very comic passages, which are all part of the pleasure, I would argue, of the text. But I can't relay that to you here directly. And so we can talk about the text. We can talk about certain thematic features. And one of them is the use of leitmotif. And Thomas Mann himself was very interested in Wagnerian opera. And one of the innovations of Wagnerian opera is this idea of a leitmotif, which essentially translates into a leading motif, a leading theme or idea within the music. If you want to understand the leitmotif from a contemporary perspective, all you have to do, for example, is watch Star Wars. As soon as you hear the Imperial March, you know that the stormtroopers are coming. That's essentially a leitmotif. Or it's common in all film music, but especially pronounced in Star Wars. Anakin's theme is like love across the stars. His doomed love for Padme is used as a leitmotif, and we have foreshadowing that occurs when we see, or when Anakin is mentioned. And of course, beautifully, there are elements in the score where the theme of Darth Vader is foreshadowed within Anakin's romantic theme, etc. This use of leitmotif, which would become incredibly prominently used in cinema, in fact, is a key part of cinematic language, is something that Wagner helped create. Now, of course, it would be wrong to suggest that nobody else had done it before. Like if you watch The Barber of Seville or something, you'll associate certain tunes with the barber and certain tunes with the loved one, etc. But the way in which, for Wagner, these themes would be richly developed throughout the work and contradicted in almost a dialogue with themselves is a distinctly Wagnerian innovation. In fact, what a lot of people disliked about Wagner when his music first came out was precisely this notion that he was less interested in plot, but more interested in musical development. But vice versa, again, Wagner being very controversial, a lot of people thought that Wagner was too much like a dramaturgist, that he was introducing too many theatrical elements in what was supposed to be a beautiful aesthetic work of arias, etc. So everybody has a bone to pick when it comes to Wagner, and we could cover that in another lecture. Now, Thomas Mann himself is interested in the idea of leitmotif because he brings them back into the work. And the way in which he brings them back into the work is that he has certain obsessions that occur or reoccur throughout the novel. One of them being hands. He has an immense obsession with the motif of hands. And this reflects an obsession within the family themselves. They're constantly observing or making observations about what people's hands look like. And one of the aspects of family pride in the novel is that they pride themselves on having very small and pale and sort of blue-veined hands, which of course is also an aristocratic affectation. After all, they have hands of people who will spend more time writing or poring over accounts than they will working or tilling the fields. And so their hands, and their hands being so unblemished, becomes a key identifier for them. And you know what's really interesting? I hate to bring up Lagerfeld again, but he's such an interesting character from a Hamburg perspective, is that if you, Karl Lagerfeld always wore gloves. I mean, he's more well known for always wearing sunglasses, but he mostly wore gloves. And he was asked in an interview, why does he always wear gloves, even when he's inside? And he said, the reason I always wear gloves is because my mother would always comment negatively on my hands. In fact, it's one of those affectations of these mercantile families that he grew up in, is that they were obsessed with people's hands. And this is where I want to give you a very brief glimpse into my own personal history, which is that my grandmother on my German side grew up in one of these families. In fact, she grew up here in Hamburg, in Blankenese. And she had the same thing with hands. She had this obsession with talking about what people's hands looked like. And even when I was a child and growing up, she would always say things about my hands. And as she reached the end of her life, she would talk about some of her boyfriends from when she was young and working as a nurse in London. And the one thing she remembered about them was their hands. And so what Thomas Mann does is that he clearly is drawing from life here, that there was an obsession amongst his contemporaries within those classes of Hamburg merchants, that they were proud of their hands. And they were proud of having hands that looked like they didn't do work. The smaller, the better, the finer, the more sophisticated. And of course, this is also why gloves were such a big thing at the time, because you could mask your hands. And some of the wealthiest families were precisely those producing gloves. Like, for example, in France, one of the old mercantile families that produces gloves are the Maison Fabre. This is one of those type affectations, if you will, the covering up of the hands, the fetishization of the hands. And this is why, to make a leap here, I know I'm being a bit associative, if you read Philip Roth's novels, I think it's the novel, I'm trying to remember what it is. Jolene, do you remember what it is? Is it The Plot Against America? Or is it The Human Stain? I can't remember. No, it's the one. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's one of the Philip Roth novels. Essentially, is about a man who grows up as like a successful businessman. His daughter ends up becoming an anarchist, etc. It's a tragedy, and but his father was a glove merchant who owned glove factories. And again, we have this theme of hands coming through. And so throughout the Buddenbrooks, there's an obsession with people's hands and what they look like. And for example, there's a character who feels like the Buddenbrooks weren't sufficiently interested in the arts, that they were interested in accounting and money, but not actually interested in performing. In fact, that they liked music. This is the wife of Thomas Buddenbrook says that the problem with the Buddenbrooks is that they simply consume music, that they think music is something pleasant and pretty that should be in the background, not something that you should actually create yourself or wrestle with. That music should therefore be aesthetically pleasing and pretty, but of course, they're against, the Buddenbrooks would be against Wagner, they would be against atonalism, etc., as being too challenging, too demanding. And what she tries to do is to have the son of Thomas Buddenbrook learn how to play the piano, because she believes that his hands have so much potential. And the battle for this young man's hands, to turn them into the hands of a pianist or the hand of a businessman, becomes one of the key contestations within the novel. But also, for example, when we see deceased characters, there will be descriptions like they're looking at their corpse and nothing in their face reminds them of who that person once was. It's like they look like a wax figure resembling the mother they loved, except for the hands. In the hands, they find the truth of the family tree. And of course, this is where Thomas Mann's famous irony comes in. This is when a fly will, of course, land on the hand of the corpse, signifying decay, etc. And so one of the leitmotiva that occurs over and over again is this obsession, this fetish that he has with characters' hands. And if you're reading Buddenbrooks, you might enjoy actually sort of taking note every time he mentions somebody's hands. Another thing that he's obsessed with, like a motif that runs throughout this book, which is very important as a motif to Thomas Mann himself in his own life. In fact, he and his brother, who was also an author and a journalist, would end up having an enormous falling out over this exact issue. And that issue is the idea of politics versus the arts, the idea of money versus the aesthetic. And one of the ideas that runs throughout this book is essentially the clash between a mindset, to use a contemporary term, that wants to achieve individual status, that wants to do the honorable thing, to protect the family, intergenerational wealth, to represent the family honor, essentially the conservative idea of what it means to be a good member of the family, versus the individual inclination towards aesthetic pleasure, to wanting to go to the theater, to experience the arts, to live and travel and have a meaningful, rich existence. And what's so beautiful about Thomas Mann's writing is that it's never normative. And what I mean by that is it's never telling you how to live. It never says, oh, you should be a good, loyal member of the family, or you should live and go to the theater and dedicate your life to the arts. Instead, he essentially points out how both sides end up being doomed, how both the individualist who wants to lead a life of aesthetic pleasure versus the loyal family member, they're both doomed. They're both fundamentally doomed to fail. It's a tragedy, after all. It's tragicomic in places, but it's fundamentally a tragedy. And so Thomas Buddenbrook resembles the proper son, the one who becomes the businessman, who has to repress his emotion in a Victorian fashion to never really reveal what he's thinking or what he's feeling. And his brother Christian Buddenbrook is the one who represents individuality, who represents wanting to talk about his feelings and his emotions, who doesn't want to be the company man. And each of them is allowed to win their own victories. For example, a key test. A key test is when their mother is passing away. In fact, it's one of the most beautiful and most famous examples of realist writing because it depicts in a very unsentimental and very non-melodramatic fashion the mother's death. Essentially, the mother knows that she is dying. She knows, or at least she knows that she's at risk of dying. And so she takes very great interest in her own process of death. She thinks about it. She constantly converses with the doctors. One imagines that she might even start writing about it. It's the depiction of a woman who knows she is dying, who nevertheless has the presence of mind to think critically about what it means to be approaching death. And once she reaches the last stretch of her life, it means, of course, that her family come to her bedside, which is very difficult for them to bear because she is suffering greatly, as many people did in the last moments of their life when medicine wasn't nearly as advanced as it is today. And at this point, the more artistically inclined brother cannot bear it. And so he essentially leaves until she has died. Whereas the older brother, Thomas, stays at her bedside and has to watch the whole gruesome ordeal until finally she passes on. And they have an enormous fight about this, the two brothers. And Thomas Buddenbrook essentially says that everybody has to bring what he calls a Leidensopfer, which is a sacrifice of suffering, that they owe it to their mother to be with her, even though there's nothing they can do for her. That, of course, he suffers, and yet his family and his love for his family decrees that he is with her at her end. Whereas the brother who claimed that he couldn't take it, that he was suffering mentally from it, who went away, was therefore making the selfish claim. Now, of course, the brother argues the exact other way around. He says, you don't feel as deeply as I do. For you, it's easy to do these things, but I can't do them. And so we have two perspectives on what it means to be an individual versus what it means to be a loyal member of the family. The same is true for Tony Buddenbrook. Fundamentally, she wants to do what's right for the family. And yet, as a woman, she's not expected or even allowed to take over reign of the company, certainly not at the end of the 19th century. And so what she is supposed to do, what is expected of her, is to make a good marriage, to marry someone who will strengthen the family's finances. And what's very tragic in the novel is that in the beginning, she actually falls in love with a young, well-educated medical student who will probably do well for himself. But the problem is his family is not a well-known family. They're not a merchant family. And so she is forbidden to marry the young man. And yet, fundamentally, the couple of things that she derives from her conversations with that young man when she's first in love, as like a 16, 17-year-old, she adopts all of his opinions about the world, which newspapers to read, which newspapers not to read, his opinions on the aristocracy. I'll talk about that in a moment. She adopts all of his views. And then for the rest of her life, even as she's forced into various marriages that are not made out of love, but made out of financial interest, she adopts them as her own. It's a very tragic, slightly ironic way to look at it. And she makes multiple proper marriages that nevertheless all fail. They all come to naught. She marries swindlers and crooks who are trying to simply get at the family money. And so once again, this idea of family duty is complicated. Should she have followed her heart and married the person she loved? Or should she have married for the family? Both of them brought the family into ill repute. Once again, it is a tragedy. Now, I wanted to return to this idea of aristocracy because it's very interesting. At the beginning of the novel, when Antony Buddenbrook falls in love with this young man, at a certain point, this young man expresses himself critically about the aristocracy. It's a wonderful passage where he says, I can't stand the aristocracy, etc. And Antony Buddenbrooks makes the perfectly reasonable and yet somewhat naive response. She says, well, have you ever met any? And he says, no. And then she says, well, I've actually met many aristocrats, and I think they're not that bad. Some of them are not great, but overall, they're pretty nice people. And this is where the young man makes a really important argument. He says, I'm not talking about particular instances of the aristocracy. In other words, individual aristocrats, whether some of them are good and some aren't. I'm talking about the institution of aristocracy in general. In other words, his critique is that of the universal system of aristocracy and the universal inequality, which is baked into the system of social representation that comes with it. Whereas what she's doing is emphasizing certain good ones and certain bad ones. And this goes back to a key piece of writing from the French Revolution from Saint-Just, where he wrote that the reason the king was being put on trial was not to determine whether or not he was a good king, but it was the monarchy itself which had to be put on trial. And this in the novel is essentially what this young, well-educated man, who's a student in Göttingen, one of the intellectual hubs of Germany, in southern Germany, is arguing. He's saying, the point isn't to evaluate whether some members of the aristocracy are good or nice and others aren't in a normative fashion. The point is to systemically, on a universal level, indict the institution of aristocracy itself. And this is then an argument that Antony Buddenbrooks herself enjoys repeating throughout her life at many gatherings with aristocrats. In fact, one of the ironic, deeply biting aspects of this entire novel is that the merchant classes like to distinguish themselves from the aristocracy as being Protestants who work for their wealth, who have earned it, who have pulled themselves up from their bootstraps, etc. And yet, fundamentally, they seek to be like the aristocrats. They seek to be little kings and emperors. There's a beautiful, painfully dark, ironic scene where Thomas Buddenbrook, who has just gone through some of the most difficult periods of his life, has had an enormous fight with his brother. He stands and sulks at his window. His brother has just told him that the world is a big place and that if he only got out of the office, he would realize that his work isn't that important and there's more in the world than the company. And this is where Thomas Mann stands at the window. It's raining. We should imagine like a Bremen, Hanseatic or Hamburg type landscape. He's looking out the window and he thinks to himself, essentially, better to be a big fish in a small pond than a small fish in a big pond. And he thinks to himself quite earnestly, he says, nothing distinguishes me from an emperor of yore, except I am the emperor of my house. I am the emperor of this town. And so why would I leave my town if in this town I am royalty? And this narrow-mindedness is, of course, deeply tragic because he's dedicated his entire life to upholding an inanimate idea, the idea of his family, the idea of their intergenerational wealth. In fact, there's a plaque above their home that signifies their family crest. And every time he walks under the threshold of this crest, he feels beholden to it, that he has to continue their family story. And yet, this is where, again, the Thomas Mann irony comes in. The house they're living in is a house they bought from another merchant family that found ruin a generation before and had to sell it. In fact, here's another recurring leitmotif, property. The idea, and Thomas Mann writes beautifully about this. He writes about why is it that it's always the things that represent the peak of our success that also, ironically, come to be the very thing that represent our downfall. And for him, it's the house. Because at a certain point, Thomas Buddenbrook is financially very successful. He's just been appointed to be a senator, which is the highest honor for his family. And he decides to build a house from scratch, to build this enormous villa. And yet, from there on out, everything goes wrong. The house was his biggest mistake. It was his one moment of vanity. He built this enormous house, and from then on, everything goes downhill. And yet, at the end of the novel, when he's forced to sell this house, his sister Antony is distraught. She says, if you sell the house, it's like you've sold out our family. And then suddenly the house has come to represent the family, not the members of the family. And yet this house didn't even exist for multiple generations. It was built to impress. And so again, it's a sad story. There's multiple levels of irony here. There's obsession on hands, the obsession with property, the obsession with the motif between the artistic pursuit versus the ambition to be a good, proper businessman. And if you read the book, you'll find more contrasting themes, like the theme between Catholicism and Protestantism. For example, when the characters are dying or when family members are dying, uh, Thomas Buddenbrook always insists to hire Catholic nurses because he feels like the Catholics are better when it comes to not wanting his money versus the Protestant nurses who are simply trying to get paid for longer, etc. Of course, it's a prejudice, but it's a prejudice unique to those times. And this is what Thomas Mann is able to show so beautifully throughout the novel. And when I'm talking about irony, it's really important for me to explain to you what I mean by Thomas Mann's irony. In fact, perhaps that can be the concluding aspect of this video. So, irony can be something that's used in rhetoric for dramatic effects. And the problem with irony is that it can be really tasteless. It can be really overdone. For example, one of my favorite authors, the Austrian novelist, or I really should say short story writer mostly, novella writer, Stefan Zweig, loves using irony. If you read some of his histories, for example, he wrote a history about Balzac or a history about Marie Antoinette. In the history of Marie Antoinette, he will conclude his chapters with things like, "It was at the exact moment that Marie Antoinette's life became more slow moving that the turmoil in the nation picked up." This contrast, this irony between Marie Antoinette becoming more settled in life and the beginnings of the French Revolution, domestic unrest brewing, is ironic. And yet when you put it like that, when you put it so crassly, it's not, to my mind, a little bit overused. It's a romanticization. It doesn't really undermine anything. It actually serves to re-emphasize certain tropes, certain black and white depictions, that we have villains versus the saviors, etc., the good times versus the bad. Even if you read the famous opening line of Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times," we have here already an undermining of the rhetorical trope of irony in romantic writing. It's also why Dickens is one of the realist writers par excellence, because one of the key aspects of realism is it's always undermining romanticism, which was the key novelistic genre preceding it. When Dickens writes, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times," he's not saying there were the bad times and then came the good times. He's saying they were both at the same time. That's so much more radical to essentially say for some people, these were the best times, and for most people, these were the worst of times. In fact, the entire opening sequence of A Tale of Two Cities is an irony against romantic irony. It's that there's spoilers for A Tale of Two Cities. The opening sequence is that we have a wheel, essentially a cart containing barrels of wine that's going up a street. And the cart is overturned, and the barrels of wine break in the street. And all the wine runs down the street like blood, turning and staining the street red. And all the people run out of their homes and start drinking it up. This image of wine and plenty in the streets, but also bloodshed in the streets, is not only ironic foreshadowing, it is the realist irony that it is both the best and the worst. Not it was the best and then it became the worst, or vice versa. It is both, which is an undermining of the romantic irony, the trope, which is a rhetorical, like, if you will, like overdoing or laying it too thick. One of my favorite quotes, I've mentioned this before in a video, does the same thing in Brecht's writing. Brecht, the German poet Bertolt Brecht, who comes later, but also a modernist writer, he has a sequence of poems that he wrote about Hollywood. And one of the things that he writes about Hollywood, which is really beautiful, it's very much like Dickens, actually. He says, Hollywood, the best way to describe Hollywood, and LA, etc., is that God had become lazy, and that he realized that instead of creating heaven and hell, he could create one place that was heaven for some, but hell for most. And that place is called Hollywood. And here again, we have the realistic irony versus romantic irony. Romantic irony is you go to Hollywood and you're a nobody, and then you become a star. It's like you went from being nobody to being a star, or from being a star back to being nobody. It's essentially a black and white trope. Whereas his argument is that it's precisely what makes Hollywood glitzy that makes it so horrible. It's precisely the dream of Hollywood that contains its true horror. It's two sides of the same coin. This is also, excuse me, what Thomas Mann achieves. He goes from the trope of irony in romanticism to realist irony that shows that it is both the best of times and the worst of times, precisely because for some it is the best of times. That therefore tragedy is not the opposite of success. It's the tragedy that lies within this very success itself, coming into its own. There's so many instances of irony, of course, in Thomas Mann's writing. But one of the really beautiful passages comes towards the end of the novel when, and again, the obsession with hands, you will notice here. Once again, spoilers for Buddenbrooks. So the Thomas Buddenbrook, who at this point is, himself middle-aged, he's a senator, he's very dignified, very, very successful. He leaves one of the gatherings that he has with other senators, and he's dressed in like ceremonial fine garb, which includes white gloves. In fact, you can look up photos of this, and they're still made today. These are white dress gloves that have almost no seams or markings on them. They're very, very fine gloves. And he walks out of the gate of this very ceremonial setting, and he walks into the streets. And the street that he's walking into contains a fish market. Again, very, very northern Germany. I literally just yesterday I was going for a walk and went by like a fish delicatesse that was claiming to be like the gem of German cuisine, etc. And so the scene begins in a very Dickensian way, is that the fish market is setting up. And what happens in the fish market, of course, it's dirty and people are butchering the fish, etc. And some of the fish escape from their basket or from the table, and they escape out into the street. And so Thomas Mann has this quite dark image of a fish lying in a puddle of mud, flapping as he sort of expires. It's quite gruesome. Now, the doors open, and Thomas Buddenbrook comes out with a cane and wearing his fine white gloves, and he walks through the market, and it's a longer passage, so I'll shorten it. Essentially, he goes to the dentist, etc., which initiates the problem. But it all culminates in a heart attack. And he suffers what becomes a fatal heart attack. And the chapter, which opens with the fish lying and flapping in the mud, ends with him falling face forward into the mud. And what's key here, and this is really quite beautiful, I think, is that it's not that he is likened to the fish, right? It's not that, he falls in the mud like the fish, which would be a bit crass and romantic. It's that his white glove falls into the puddle. And thereby the glove that comes undone from the hand, revealing the hand underneath, the glove is mirrored with the fish. This pure piece of finery that lies totally ruined now in the wet, murky water resembles that of this glittering fish. And the glittering fish is, of course, the very core of Northern German trade and identity and its cuisine and its culture. And so it's not simply that the man, Thomas Buddenbrook, is contrasted with the fish, which would be a bit crass. It's that the very markers of pride and self-importance and identity are contrasted in an ironic way. It's deeply tragic. It's really very moving. Now, I'd like to end on the final part of the book, which is unusual. Essentially, you could even make the argument that the final part of the book exists as its own novella. In fact, that's not just my argument. I think in the last year or so, a new translation of the final part of the book came out in English that was simply marketed as being its own book, as not even being connected to the Buddenbrooks. And the final part of the book is the story of the youngest member of the family, Justus Buddenbrook. And Justus Buddenbrook is therefore the son of Thomas Buddenbrook. And Justus Buddenbrook is like a Proustian little boy. He's very sensitive. He's a little bit neurotic. He's überempfindlich, as you would put it in German. He's overly sensitive. But yet his sensitivity is like a double-edged sword because he's also a musical prodigy. These hands, once again, the hands, which were once the sign of the noblesse of the German pseudo-aristocracy, the mercantile class, the merchant class, now are supposed to be the hands of a young, gifted pianist. And yet, once again, this being a tragedy, it doesn't end particularly well for this young boy. And so what the final 100 pages of the Buddenbrooks are is a day in the life of Justus Buddenbrook. And now I want to say something that I really want you to pay attention to, which is here once again, you have to see this last 100 pages in connection with the rest of the novel. After all, the book, that section of the book literally ends on, "This was a day in the life of Justus Buddenbrook." But here's the thing. This is an epic novel. This is a novel that is about multiple generations of families, that in which years go by in a span of 1 or 2 pages. Life and death and matrimony all come and go. And now we have 100 pages dedicated to one day in the life of this young boy, going to school, suffering the agony of whether or not he's prepared for his Latin examination. It's totally bizarre from a formal point of view. And yet this, once again, is Thomas Mann's beautiful modernist gesture. It's to say that what appeared to be the irony of the Buddenbrooks, the irony of a family going from riches to rags, if you will, isn't really just a tragedy. It's also the development of a new novelistic form. That the realist novelistic form is dedicated to these slightly aggrandizing epic storytelling motifs about wealthy, successful individuals. It's the very realist style is a style which would have appealed to the Buddenbrooks. It's a distinctly self-important narrative mode. In fact, you could say that this is also part of why Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks became so famous in Germany, because Germans like to think of themselves as being like the Buddenbrooks. And yet this beautiful addendum, this novella within the novel, is radically focused on the inner life, the psychological realism of Justus Buddenbrook, which is in no way attached to his family's identity. It's no way attached to a notion of self-importance about his position in the world. It's simply the tragedy, the heaven and hell, the grand emotions that have come from one day of going to school as a child. And Thomas Mann's implicit argument is therefore that within the span of one day of a 10-year-old boy at school, we can find the very same universal motifs about heaven and hell, about pleasure and suffering, about justice and wrongdoing. All of that in one day of this little boy's life that we could find in 4 generations of this epic mercantile family. And that means that the novel undermines itself at the end of the book. That the novella embedded in the Buddenbrooks progresses and evolves the literary genre itself. And so what appears to be a tragedy of one family, and certainly, spoilers, it's a tragedy because young Justus does not survive, unfortunately. It's very sad. What is a tragedy in the particular is on the universal level of artistic expression, fundamentally a success. It's the moving forward of a new form of writing, of a new experience. And so we undergo a transition from romantic, lyric poeticism, Schiller, Goethe, etc., Hölderlin, towards the realist writing of the Buddenbrooks. And what emerges is a very modern form of psychological realism that feels much more contemporary than anything in the Buddenbrooks. And if you think about it, this is the story of Thomas Mann's life. This is a novel that comes out at the very beginning, the starting gun, if you will, of the 20th century. A century that would find in itself an enormous capacity for evil and human suffering. And yet, in the beginning of the 20th century, it's all still coming into being. That Thomas Mann understands that to live in 1902 is like to be little Justus going to school, unformed, not knowing where it's going. That all the certainties of the 19th century, all the pomp and grandeur, all the things that seemed to be important in this pre-democratic Germany were about to fade away. In fact, we're already gone. And so what's so beautiful about this novel is that it is never nostalgic. It's never sentimental. In fact, the moments in which the characters allow themselves some fleeting sentimentality, they are almost always punished for it. It's completely not melodramatic. There are fights between characters, there are melodramatic moments, and yet these are the moments in which the characters reveal their inner contradictions, their inner absurdities. And that's the whole point of the novel. It's to say, literature moves forward, even though the Buddenbrooks don't. That the process of aesthetic discovery, of trying to write truth, continues. That the very form of artistic progression evolves, even as these lives fade away. And so it's not a conservative monument to an old way of life that was supposedly better. It's a deeply earnest, intimate, loving portrayal of a nation and a family that will and can never be the same. And Thomas Mann mourns this, but also celebrates it, which is such a key idea for all artistic drive. Because it's never about saying the past was better. In fact, this would be the death of all art, to glorify that which was. It's about relentlessly moving forward, understanding where you're coming from to try to illuminate where you think you're going. And this process is the process for Thomas Mann that reveals the ultimate irony. The ultimate Thomas Mannian irony is that we never know where we are in time. We're always trying to make sense of the present by means of identifying with the past which has already been lost. And we don't know where we're going, but we're afraid of change. And so we try to find ourselves in the world. And in the act of trying to find ourselves, we create ourselves. And through creating ourselves, we create the world. And this dialectical project is perhaps the ultimate leitmotif in the Buddenbrooks. The idea that destiny is not something that is imposed from above. None of the characters are simply slavishly following a predetermined fate. It is that the very things we do to resist fate sometimes end up enabling it, and the very times that we seem to be accepting it as our own, that we do something which creates or initiates unknown consequences. Therefore, here we find the beginning of modern subjectivity, the beginning of modern man in an uncertain world, something which would become hugely important, and of course, much more, if you will, pessimistically depicted in modernist literature afterwards, in Beckett, in Brecht, in Kafka. But in Thomas Mann, we have a moment in time that I find really precious. A moment in time in which one world is already dying and a new one has yet to be born. And to quote that famous expression from Antonio Gramsci, that it is the old which is dying and the new has not yet been born. It is in this interregnum that all manner, a host of morbid symptoms appear. And that is what Thomas Mann is fundamentally interested in. The morbid symptoms, which for him are often ironic, the morbid symptoms that manifest in that progression, which is of course also inevitably that of decay. That one way of life is decaying and another has yet to be born. That is his interest. It's an immensely ambitious project for a 26-year-old writer. And if you get into Thomas Mann, if you start reading his other books, you'll see that with each and every novel, he's trying to catch up. He's trying to make sense. He's trying to revise and rethink his previous positions. The Magic Mountain, my favorite novel by him, would not be written without the war. In the same way that the Buddenbrooks would not have been written without Thomas Mann's own lived experience in one of these families. And so it's a lifelong project of discovery that aesthetically mirrors the self-discovery of a nation and a people and a changing society. That is Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks, and I really hope that you'll give it a shot. Thank you so much for watching today. This has been a weekly session where I try to hopefully share some enthusiasm for philosophy, literature, the arts in general. And if you'd like to support these classes and join our learning community where I host a whole bunch of extra features, including a weekly podcast and Q&A discussion, please consider becoming a patron. If you want to become a patron, all you have to do is go to www.patreon.com/JulianPhilosophy or click the link in my bio. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.